Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here, and today we're going to look at Unit 731, the research facility from hell. Empire building isn't just about raw power, it's about strategy. As the world was heading towards one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century, the Second World War, Japan set its sights on global dominance. However, in terms of global conflict, they faced a difficult truth. They weren't going to be able to out-manufacture global giants like the USA or Great Britain, but Japan's strength wasn't in its production, it was in its innovation. Rather than striving to outproduce their enemies, they looked inwards to reduce their own casualties. They looked at other countries' past wars and analysed their casualty patterns. The numbers revealed a surprising truth. For every soldier lost in battle, many more, sometimes dozens more, were incapacitated by an unseen enemy, preventable diseases. In order to solve the problem, the 1930s saw the rise of several research facilities in Japan and in its occupied territories in Manchuria and China. Among them was Unit 731. On the surface, Unit 731 primarily focused on epidemic prevention and water purification. It studied diseases like cholera, which had caused significant casualties within the Japanese army. However, much of this was a facade. What was actually going on within Unit 731 was top secret. Within the walls of Unit 731, teams of doctors and researchers conducted gruesome experiments on innocent civilians. It was also where some of Japan's first bioweapons were constructed and tested. It all started with the Japanese government looking over the vast amount of knowledge that their scientists held about diseases. They quickly realised that whilst they could be used for treatment and healing, there was also a great potential for weaponization. They came up with a strategy to deploy biological weapons on a mass scale. As you can probably imagine, developing an efficient bioweapon isn't easy. Much more data was needed to be collected. This task was entrusted to General Shiro Ishii, the overseer of the Unit 731 facility in northern China. Under this man's leadership, widespread tests on the local population was initiated. The Japanese secret police were tasked with sourcing humans from nearby villages, prisoner of war camps and prisons. Captured Chinese and Korean civilians, along with Soviet and Western prisoners of war, were confined to tiny cells and treated like guinea pigs. They were inhumanly referred to as maruta, meaning wooden logs, and they were subjected to some extremely horrific experiments. Prisoners were deliberately infected with a range of diseases, including cholera, typhus, and the bubonic plague. To determine the most efficient means of transmission, Japanese scientists exposed inmates to infected fleas, or they confined them in cells full of diseased rats. At times they would infect a single individual, then place them among a group of healthy inmates to track the spread of the disease. Some prisoners would be directly injected with pathogens. These injections would often consist of blended up human organs harvested from an infected individual. Some prisoners were even given multiple infections simultaneously. Possibly this was because the Japanese wanted to cross-mutate pathogens. Venereal diseases were also under investigation. Inmates were forced to have sex with one another to monitor the transmission and progression of the disease. With all these diseases, some prisoners would receive experimental treatments, others were simply left to die. And even if a treatment was successful and a prisoner recovered, they would eventually be killed so that their bodies could be dissected and analysed. Sometimes they didn't even wait for a prisoner to die, they would be vivisected and their organs examined whilst they were still alive. This process allowed researchers to study the effects of various diseases on internal organs at various stages and compare them with healthy samples. The doctors at Unit 731 had a particular interest in the effects of diseases on unborn children. Any pregnancies that resulted from these forced copulation experiments weren't terminated, not immediately. They were allowed to gestate. Sometimes the fetuses would be cut from the womb whilst the patient was awake. Another type of research that was carried out at Unit 731 was the effects of chemical weapons. One ex-worker from the facility would later reveal that the facility had its own special gas chamber. This was a small room equipped with a chair and a glass wall. Prisoners would be restrained in the chair, and various types of poisonous gases such as mustard gas, phosgene or blister agents were released into the chamber. Adults, children and animals were frequently used in these tests. A scientist who worked at the facility recounted the ordeal of a young Russian mother and her daughter. He remembered the mother frantically trying to shield her daughter from breathing in the gas, and researchers safely on the outside of the chamber timing their convulsions. One of the gases tested in the chamber was phosgene. One former worker from Unit 731 recalls a particular time when one of the inmates survived the phosgene chamber. He said, "As the gas spread, suffocating the victims, changes in pulse and other significant symptoms were observed and recorded until death occurred." One of the Maruta was a 68-year-old man. Earlier, he was injected with plague bacteria, but he didn't die. He was subjected to a phosgene test, but he survived. The military doctor injected air into his veins, but still he lived. So the doctor used a very thick needle and again injected air into his veins, but the man survived even that. The doctors eventually killed this man by hanging him on a tree. Other experiments involved testing flamethrowers. Prisoners were taken to a firing range and chained to wooden stakes at varying distances, and then subjected to terrifying burns as streams of fire were directed at them. Those fortunate enough to survive were returned to their cells. Some of these burn victims would receive treatment, others didn't. Ultimately, they would all be executed and then dissected, with every detail of their injuries meticulously documented. The same firing range was also used to test any number of conventional weapons, from grenades and bombs to various firearms. Again, live prisoners were used in these tests. Additionally, some prisoners were also used for bayonet practice, most notably during the training of the Youth Corps. Some executions, chillingly, seem to have been driven by sheer amusement. Seasoned soldiers at the facility who wanted to showcase their talents in swordsmanship allegedly beheaded prisoners as a demonstration of their skills. Dozens of inmates were forced into a kneeling position in front of a long trench, only to be methodically beheaded by the Japanese soldiers one by one. Over 3,000 individuals were employed at Unit 731. The scientists came from both military and civilian sectors. Leading Japanese universities sent their staff and students to contribute to these inhumane experiments. They often returned with samples which included organs or body parts preserved in large glass jars. One student would later recall, "I prepared many laboratory specimens of human origin to be preserved in formalin. Among them were heads, arms, legs, internal organs, and whole bodies. The jars stood in long rows. In some there were even children and infants." Ironically, the tremendous amount of death and suffering inflicted at Unit 731 created some of the best doctors in the world. The plan to cut their own losses to a minimum really seemed to be working for the Japanese Empire. Japanese battlefield medicine was significantly more advanced than other countries. Despite these advances, as time went on, the tides of war shifted, and Japan found itself on the brink of defeat. The threat of a Soviet invasion grew imminent. The Japanese High Command anticipated that they would have to battle the Russians in Siberia, so this led to Unit 731 conducting Frostbite research. As the name suggests, it involved inducing frostbite in prisoners. For instance, they would leave prisoners tied to a pole outside with their hands outstretched, then they would pour water over their hands. This was during the harsh Manchurian winter, when temperatures often plummeted below -20 degrees Celsius. Once the prisoners' hands had turned black from the frostbite, scientists would attempt to reverse the damage by using experimental methods such as drugs, open flames, or hot water. In one attempt to restore circulation to severely frostbitten hands, the application of hot water caused all the flesh to peel away from the bone. The prisoner was left untreated. The scientists wanted to see how long it would take for gangrene to develop. As the research into frostbite treatment progressed, so did their research into weaponized diseases. It remains the unit's top priority throughout its existence. As the war raged on, research progressed rapidly, leading to field tests in Manchurian villages. Research teams from Unit 731 would visit a village, then release pathogens among the unsuspecting villagers. They might infect the water supply, or trade them items infested with lice carrying bubonic plague. One account even mentions scientists giving sweets laced with diseases to local children. Residents of these villages had no means to protect themselves against outbreaks of typhus or bubonic plague. This region of China was relatively undeveloped during this period. As a result, when researchers returned to certain villages after conducting their tests, they often found them deserted with bodies strewn everywhere. After typhoid and cholera cultures were introduced into the water in the Zhejiang province, over 1,700 Japanese soldiers became infected and died. Incidents like these weren't viewed as setbacks, but rather as sources of valuable data. The fact that these were Japanese soldiers was completely disregarded. In 1944, Japan attempted to conduct its first major bioweapon attack on US forces. It was a devious move, given that every other faction in World War II adhered to the Geneva Convention Treaty prohibiting the development and use of biological weapons. A submarine loaded with mutated pathogens and infected lice was dispatched to unleash its deadly cargo on the American forces. However, before it got a chance to do this, the submarine was sank in the Pacific. In 1945, Japan planned another major bioweapon attack. This plan was called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. In the face of losing the war, Japan made a last-ditch effort to turn the tide in their favour. Their plan involved deploying submarine-based aircraft known as fugos or fire balloons. These would release bombs containing plague-infested fleas over Southern California. The idea was to spread disease among the civilian population and create panic and disruption. However, after the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese surrendered and Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night was scrapped. Many years after the war, some of the surviving researchers and staff from the facility, burdened by their guilt, confessed to the atrocities that they'd seen and committed at Unit 731. In their confessions, some still referred to the prisoners as Maruta, logs. The Japanese government initially tried to downplay these confessions, but in the late 80s, a large number of specimens such as drilled human skulls and organs in glass jars was discovered in Tokyo. These discoveries were attributed to Unit 731. Until then, the Japanese government were maintaining the narrative that such a facility never existed. Even today, Japanese officials are very reluctant to discuss Unit 731. As for the men who chose to confess after working there, almost every account mentions vivisections, living, conscious prisoners cut open without any anesthesia. One man, who was a medical assistant at the unit and who insisted on remaining anonymous, recalled his first vivisection on a living prisoner. The fellow knew that it was over for him, so he didn't struggle when we led him into the room and tied him down. But when I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming. I cut him open from the chest to the stomach, and his face was all twisted in agony. He made this unimaginable sound. He was screaming so horribly, but then finally he stopped. Another account recalls a young pregnant Chinese woman who, after being sedated with chloroform, woke up as she was being dissected and her organs were being removed and placed into glass jars. The terrified woman pleaded with the scientists to spare her unborn child. More chloroform was administered and she slipped back into unconsciousness. She bled to death shortly afterwards. There aren't any first-hand testimonies from the prisoners. Being sent to Unit 731 meant certain death. Not a single inmate made it out alive. It's safe to assume that those that did confess didn't reveal everything that they'd seen. Some of the things that went on there will never be revealed. Things like vivisections conducted on living children and babies are conveniently missing from the majority of confessions. Although in a booklet released in Japan following a major exhibition on Unit 731, there's a particularly chilling piece of advice. A seemingly handy tip directed at new doctors in the facility. It regards to experimenting on a 3-day-old baby. It says, usually the hands of a 3-day-old infant are clenched into a fist. But by sticking a needle in the middle finger, the baby's arms could be kept straight to make the experiment easier. The individuals responsible for these horrific experiments never faced justice. After World War II, many scientists were intercepted by the USA, not only because the knowledge they'd gained at Unit 731 was invaluable, but also because of the fear of what would have happened if their research fell into Soviet hands. Many of the researchers went on to live long and prosperous lives, often achieving notable successes in politics, academia, and medicine. As for their research, it's highly probable that detailed accounts of their experiments and the results of their bioweapon tests remain locked away in some archives within the USA. It's very doubtful that these records will ever be publicly disclosed. And so that's the story of Unit 731. Grim as all hell, but an important part of history. Thank you very much for watching, and a huge thanks as always to the patrons who are helping keep the channel going. Thank you very much for the support. If you're new to my channel, then please check out my other videos. I'm sure you'll find something else to interest you. Until next time, goodbye.